So thank you very much for coming back and on time, please. So we left the program with two of our panelists, very, very interesting presentations. And then we will make some debate. We can ask questions, please. Ask questions or make contributions short to the point related to the topic. I know that sometimes you like to do announcements and so on, but try to keep focused. And we will have a very short concluding remarks and a lunch. And I repeat again that it's not at all a sad day. I mean, not for me. You know, you have to see it as a 60 briefings, like in age. You know, you can say, oh yeah, 60, but it's a luck. There are people who don't reach 35. So it's positive. Then in the 60, you know, we are still here and we enjoy it. So it's positive. So it's not a sad day at all. And again, what is important from all my colleagues and myself is that the beneficiaries we have in the field continue to be supported by whoever. To me, it doesn't, at least I speak on my personal capacity, it doesn't matter. That what matters is that they get the assistance they deserve. So in the second panel, we spoke a lot globally this morning, but we also spoke a lot about Africa. And one of the strengths of the ACP-EU cooperation and of CTA has been the ACP, so the C and the P, Caribbean and Pacific and the small island states, which a big part, though, are ACP, from the ACP. So I'm very, very delighted. I know it has been extremely difficult to have her. I still have to call you ambassador because I knew you as an ambassador and an excellent ambassador and a very, very good. Again, thank you for the treatment you did to me always. Who is now, was before being, you have an extensive, actually, biodata, was a researcher, like many, so came with a very strong analytical and technical background before being ambassador, was a very successful and loved ambassador in this house, in this same house, so I think it will bring back memories to you, and now is also, again, a top researcher and contributor, you would see, on different areas. Global Affairs, Brussels Diplomatic Academy, to the Fry University here, visiting professor at in Morocco, at the University of Mohammed VI, and so on. So, and very extensively publications on a very geopolitical, at least myself, I enjoy them very, very much because they are very forward thinking. And also a tweet. I follow you on tweet, and I always find it also very interesting. So try to see the speakers we have here and see their tweet accounts, because you will learn a lot that we miss. You know, you have to be continuously, you know, updated and informed. So, Ambassador Ishmael, you will bring that part of the small island economies, which have a lot in common, but also some specificities. Thank you very much for being here and made it possible.
Thank you so very much. If there are any ambassadors here, excellencies, friends, colleagues, it's a little bit of nostalgia with which well, I'm not necessarily taking the floor, I'm not standing, but will speak in this house, which for many years was a good and friendly home, and it still feels very much that way. Today, in terms of the conversation which we will have, I will speak around issues surrounding small island developing states, their characteristics, some of the systemic issues related to their size, and the issue of climate emergency. Is there anyone who could help me? I am not necessarily able to move the slides on the screen. Did I go back? Okay. Okay, as we were saying, I'll speak around a number of issues, all of which have to do with small island developing states, and in particular link this to the issue of the agricultural sector. Of course, the language of SIDS really was one that came to us as a result of a rather seminal conference which took place in Barbados in 1994 and left with us the Barbados Plan of Action. And, okay, I see. There's a little bit of a time lapse, and I speak quickly. But essentially, SIDS are located in a very tiny girdle around the tropics around the world. They represent less than 1% of the world's population, and a population in total of about a little under 70 million in all. It's fair to say that generally speaking, when we take a look at SIDS relative to that, the status of SIDS in many other parts of the world, many other countries, that SIDS are not necessarily among the poorest of the poor. Indeed, many of them are middle income, and most of the middle income SIDS are located in the Caribbean, where all the countries are middle income, with the exception of Haiti. And of course, when we speak about SIDS, there is a need sometimes to think in terms of superlative terms, beautiful countries, paradise. But I say to you, and I argue this all the time, that paradise is also a bit of a facade. Behind that facade, there are real challenges that tiny countries face as they attempt to deal with modernization of their societies and provide good livelihoods. And as we heard earlier this morning from one of my colleague presenters, the issue of dignity as well with good livelihoods is important. But there are systemic characteristics which impede or rather influence the trajectory of SIDS with respect of their own development. Very fragile environments and ecosystems, very, very narrow resource bases, high ratios of sea to land masses, highly dependent on the natural resources for goods and services. And in the case of the Pacific SIDS, they're also remote. SIDS are also extraordinarily vulnerable environmentally and economically. Located in the tropics, exceptionally vulnerable to tropical cyclones in the Pacific, hurricanes in the Caribbean, with real serious damage to infrastructure and social capital as well. Significant GDP impact, and just a couple of numbers here which I think put this in perspective. In 2004, I mean, we've had many, many hurricanes, but one stands out in terms of its sheer devastation. Hurricane Ivan hit the island of Grenada in 2004, stalled over the island for 20 hours. What we had left was a loss of 2 years' worth of GDP, 200%. Hurricane Sandy, on the other hand, when it hit the East Coast, all along the East Coast of the United States, many years later, the percentage of damages was less than 0.5% of GDP. So scale is important as well in many, many ways. SIDS are also socially and economically quite vulnerable. They're among the most highly indebted countries in the world. They experience very open economies, vulnerable to external shocks, high levels of unemployment, and indeed World Bank statistics show that in the Caribbean, Caribbean youth experience the highest levels of unemployment in the world. But even within small countries, the notion of size is also relative. So we've got Cuba, for example, in the Caribbean at 11.4 million people, and you have in the Pacific little Niue, I think it's how it's pronounced, with less than 2,000 people. But for all SIDS, the issue of size is a constraining factor. Constrains the size of domestic markets, high cost of production and doing business. The size of the labor force is small, skills are undiversified. Topography in some of the islands is an issue. But the lack of scale has real serious implications for issues pertaining to the ability to compete unless there's special provisions which allow access to protected markets. A quick little example. I call this the case study with respect of green gold, the issue of bananas in the Windward Islands. In the 1960s, when all of the countries in the Caribbean found themselves on the path towards independence, the new governments of the day thought it very important to start creating classes of peasant farmers who had clear paths towards the accumulation of assets which might lead to the creation of wealth. So they nationalized all of the plantations that had previously been owned by multinational corporations, subdivided these into very, very tiny holdings, and gave these to peasant farmers with access to certain incentives and other factors of production, including low rates of interest for loans. Bananas radically transformed rural life in all of these tiny islands. For the first time, there were roads built into the countryside. Farmers were able to afford pickup trucks to bring their bananas into markets. They were able to send their kids to school. They weren't needed on the farms in the same way. Kids wore shoes to school for the first time, and it stabilized rural economies. In the 60s, bananas were loaded this way on heads. This is a shot from the 60s in Jamaica, for example. With the transformation of agriculture in the islands, we moved to much more modern ways of transportation. And it was really and truly because rural populations had access to increasing levels of prosperity. Windward Island bananas represented less than 0.04% of world production of bananas. But the cost of production in tiny islands is really high, 2 or 3 times the cost of production on much larger plantations in Central America and South America, for example. But the impact on tiny, tiny islands was tremendous. So in the Windward Islands, you had more than 25,000 farmers, representing, in the case of the tiny island of Dominica, more than 50% of exports and more than 50% of labor. In 1993, the EU announced preferential treatment for the bananas coming into this market from former colonies. But the United States itself, a non-producer of bananas on behalf of Chiquita and Dole, which were American companies operating out of predominantly Central America, took the EU to the WTO, citing discrimination in access to the EU market. So we had dollar bananas versus very, very small scale farmers. Total collapse of the banana sector in these tiny islands. There was absolutely no way that they could compete. Banana farmers lost everything. Many homes were repossessed by banks. Children were taken out of school, and it was a period of real grave political, economic, and social instability in many of these islands. Similar story for West Indian sugar in Barbados, in places like St. Kitts and Nevis. It's fair to say, however, that for SIDS, though challenges do exist, there are opportunities as well. Opportunities, for example, with respect of tourism, which replaced agriculture as the main engine of growth for many of the islands. And it makes sense. You would think that visitors to the islands demand food, and therefore there would be great potential for forward and backward linkages to the agricultural sector. But the fact of the matter is, and this is a quote from an FAO report, that the tourism industry mainly relies on food imports as opposed to fundamentally accessing food from the local economy. And so there's very little success in matching the demand from tourism with surplus labor in agriculture, and certainly the demand for agricultural sector produced goods in the local markets. In the Eastern Caribbean, for example, less than 30% of the demand for import for food by the tourism sector is actually supplied locally. We have unexploited opportunities as well, for example, in the yachting sector. Tremendous demand for food, cut flowers and all of those sort of things. But even at the height of the fight to stay afloat, looking for markets for bananas in the Windward Islands, the British Virgin Islands, part of the community of the Eastern Caribbean states, was importing on a daily basis Chiquita and Dole bananas from neighboring Puerto Rico. Why? Because there was no means of transportation effectively to get the Windward Island bananas just a couple of 100 miles south up to very, very lucrative markets. So for many SIDS, there are serious and fundamental challenges which face the agricultural sector, but transportation as a major constraint, certainly in the Caribbean, is one which is very, very well known. The sector is characterized by mainly small producers, access to credit, seeds, fertilizers, better varieties, irrigation is very, very difficult. And today, agriculture for all SIDS faces certain characteristics: low levels of technology, low levels of entrepreneurship, low productivity, high production cost, and the list goes on. There are other elements as well. In many parts of the world where SIDS predominate, the average age of farmers is 55 and upwards. There's a societal mindset that working in agriculture is not a very good thing. And societies have also evolved their tastes towards imported processed foods with all the effects on diets and non-communicable diseases that we see rising in all SIDS across the world. In the case of the Caribbean, the regional community of 14 countries, CARICOM, today, at this point in time, the regional food bill will top 10 billion in 2020. What are the costs? Well, serious ones. A crowding out of domestic agriculture, a burden on currency exchange reserves, high levels of diet-related non-communicable diseases, rural poverty, loss of jobs, etc. Agriculture in the SIDS contributes unevenly to GDP, as low as 2% in the Bahamas, as high as 37% in PNG in the Pacific, and in the Caribbean averages about 7 to 17% outside of Haiti. And this chart, which you will see in a second, shows the inverse correlation of GDP per capita as share of agriculture to GDP. In other words, the poorest countries are the ones with the highest dependence on agriculture, and we see this in the Caribbean with respect of Haiti. Very quick look at what's happening right now with SIDS and climate change and the effects on the agricultural sector. But I think it's very hard to have a discussion about the effects of climate change on agriculture without saying that because of the size of SIDS, climate change represents a threat across all sectors, not just agriculture. And for some of the SIDS, it is an existential threat, particularly SIDS in the Pacific. In fact, they are already sinking. Vulnerability has always been a key characteristic of small island developing states. They tend to get hit harder by the shocks that come around, whether they are food and fuel crises that we saw in 2007, 2008, or the global financial crisis of 2008, or natural disasters which have become much more circular and much more deep in terms of their extreme effects over the last few years. The bottom line is that small island developing states have very little by way of economic resilience. They simply do not have the social safety nets that are required. And climate change has done just one more thing, which it has deepened vulnerability for all SIDS across the band. Climate change science notes, of course, that we can expect much more by way of extreme weather events, and the movement of ecosystems which are naturally occurring in terms of flora and fauna have already started moving across the world with real serious implications for agriculture. 3 years ago, the Caribbean saw the costliest period in its history with respect of cyclones. We had 10 major hurricanes. 6 of them were over Category 4. They were Cat 4 and 5. thousands of deaths and billions in terms of losses. The important thing here with respect of tropical systems such as this is that even when countries are still paying back public debt for roads and highways and airports, these are washed away. They are always in a cycle of building and rebuilding, even while still paying very high debt. So it's no wonder they are among the most highly indebted countries in the world. Global temperatures, we know, are set to increase. When we take a look at the Caribbean, the very dark red represents the Eastern Caribbean, and those figures are way above average sea temperatures. And we know that this is going to affect all types of natural resources, impacts on sea temperatures, corals, fisheries, and the sort of ecosystems on which so much of life depends. What we do know is that at the front line of the effects of climate change are poorest communities and poorest countries, because they're least able to cope with respect to the transitions that are required. And we've heard this morning quite a lot by way of good discussions with respect of the convergence that's required, about the changes that are required for SIDS. Those are really very difficult in terms of adaptation that's required. And adaptation itself, the islands have been in phases of adaptation for a very, very long time, but adaptation also has technical limits, it has economic limits, and there's going to come a time in those islands where very hard decisions are going to have to be made about who is protected, who is relocated, and at what cost. And of course, the impacts for agriculture we know are going to be severe: pests and diseases, water resources, water quality, soil erosion, but this is true across the world. Impacts on the blue economy we can expect. We know this. And yet the blue economy, certainly in the Pacific, the Caribbean, we've overfished a lot of our pelagic fish. But in the Pacific, the wealth of many SIDS is represented in the blue economy, as much as 10% of GDP. For example, 58% of tuna caught in the Pacific actually comes from the water of Pacific SIDS, representing $2.8 billion worth of revenue to the economies. But the challenge for SIDS, of course, in the Pacific is how to increase their share of landing of the tuna in their waters. Good note in this steps in that direction, tiny island of Vanuatu, who has recently shared a very signed on to a very good joint venture with a Chinese group that is going to ensure that a lot more of that revenue stays in the Pacific. Coming to the end of this little discussion, the FAO assessment of the Caribbean is that the Caribbean needs a blue revolution. Aquaculture can play a very big role in restabilizing fishery stocks within a short period of time, but of course needs agricultural support by way of policies and legislative support as well. Aquaculture has also been proposed as a way to boost food security in the Pacific as well. But skills, technology, and infrastructure all require much by way of investments. A lot of talk in our part of the world and the Pacific as well of exploiting links between tourism and the marine environment. We have very good examples already in place in places like Belize, in places like Fiji, and I'm not going to read all of these. Islands in the Indonesian network, always identified as models for SIDS in all parts of the world. And then finally, just a little word on agricultural, agri-tech, and SIDS. And we've heard a lot today about technology. We've also heard from one of the colleagues at this table here about technology not being the silver bullet. And certainly in the case of tiny islands, that is definitely the case. It has a role to play. It certainly has had a role to play in the Pacific with respect of monitoring illegal fishing in their waters. But there are many, I would say that if there is one thought I want to leave here this morning, is that there are also many opportunities to exploit links which we have today that we have not necessarily done a very good job at. And I just want to spend just my last remaining minute on these, that we should be doing more to specifically target small producers, provide technical and financial support to achieve commercialization and inclusion in tourism food markets, support development of farmers, cooperatives, and small producer organizations, consider centralized marketing support, support skills development and entrepreneurship, strengthen the linkages between domestic agriculture and tourism. It can be done. It's just that we're not doing things in a very structured way. Build and exploit regional value chains to create scales of production. Invest in marine transportation. We have the means to be able to do those things. Appropriate technologies. Educate consumers, health benefits to eating and buying local. Educate visitors to our part of the world. And final reflections. Behind the myth of paradise, and I always say this, is the fact that there are real people with real lives and real jobs and real kids to feed and shelter. And these tiny islands are what they have. And we've got to be able to provide opportunities to allow them to make ends meet. Sometimes in scoping far and wide for opportunities, we fail to exploit those which are already there. And I would end by saying that in times of even greater challenges, we need to devote more, not less, attention to managing better those elements which we can manage with the potential to generate real solid benefits. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those very inspiring insights. And we at CTA, with many other partners, have worked a lot on the small islands in different parts, on production, on markets, on ICTs, etc. And certainly, you have done very well on graduating to LDCs, most of you, but you still suffer of that image of paradise. I've seen myself when I have to go on mission. Oh, you go to the Caribbean. They expect me to be in the beach the whole day. You know, is that thing that, and you have very specific, like climate change, access to markets, infrastructure, still to deal with. And I thank you very much for that.